Hey guys, tonight we step into a world that smelled faintly of wood smoke, damp wool, and questionable life choices from the court of Henry VIII, who owned more clothes than common sense, to the average person trying not to die before lunch. Tudor life was built on routines that sound insane today, but were actually survival strategies. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always like seeing how far these stories travel. In the Tudor era, a hot bath isn't a luxury for you. It's a risk assessment. The kind where you sit there thinking, do I want to be slightly cleaner or continue being alive? Because from your perspective, bathing can genuinely make you sick. You've been taught your entire life that disease spreads through bad air. Not germs, not anything you can see, just invisible, deadly fumes floating around, waiting for an opportunity. And unfortunately, you also believe that hot water opens the pores of your skin. Once those pores are open, those invisible vapors can slip right into your body. So a bath isn't relaxing. It's basically unlocking your body and hoping nothing terrible walks in. Naturally, you avoid it. You might bathe a few times a year, maybe in summer when the air feels less hostile and slightly less determined to kill you. But doing it regularly, that would be considered reckless. The Tudor equivalent of saying, I'm sure it'll be fine, right before something is absolutely not fine. Instead, you rely on a different system, one that feels much safer. You wash your hands and face when needed, but the real trick is your clothing. You wear linen undergarments close to your skin, and you change those often. The linen absorbs sweat, oils, and dirt, so technically, you're staying clean. Well, clean adjacent. Your body itself? That's more of a long-term situation. And when you look around at your water sources, your decision feels completely justified. The river isn't just water, it's also waste, runoff, and whatever your neighbours decided to throw out that morning. Streets function as a kind of slow-moving experiment in everything you don't want near your skin. Even shared bathhouses reuse water in ways that make you question your will to live. So no, you're not avoiding baths because you dislike them. You're avoiding them because you have basic survival instincts. Of course, this doesn't exactly result in a pleasant-smelling environment, but that's where perfumes, herbs, and scented items come in. You don't need to be clean. You just need to smell like you made an effort. And honestly, in your world, that's good enough. In the end, skipping baths isn't laziness. It's logic. Slightly flawed logic, yes, but very convincing. And as long as you keep your pores safely closed and your linen freshly changed, you can sleep peacefully. Upright, of course. Knowing you've successfully avoided death by bath. When night falls in the Tudor era, you don't simply lie down, stretch out, and drift off like a modern human with confidence in tomorrow. No. You approach sleep carefully, like it might be your last hobby. Because in your mind, lying completely flat is concerning. Flat is how corpses rest. Flat is how people are arranged when they're done being alive. So naturally, you look at your bed, look at your future, and think, let's not rush into that position just yet. Instead, you sleep slightly upright. You prop yourself up with pillows, bolsters, or whatever vaguely supportive object you can find. Your head is elevated, your upper body angled, and your dignity questionable. But it feels safer, more alive, less corpse-adjacent. There's also some practical reasoning behind this. You believe this position helps digestion, very important when your last meal may or may not have been cooked thoroughly. It also supposedly aids breathing, which, considering the air quality you're dealing with, feels optimistic at best. And then there's the bed itself. If you're lucky, you have one. A proper bed is a status symbol, not a guarantee. It might be stuffed with straw, feathers, or something that was once alive and is now contributing in a different way. It creaks, it shifts, and it definitely has opinions. If you're less lucky, you're working with a bench, a mat, or the floor. Comfort is negotiable, survival is not. And privacy? Absolutely not part of the experience. You're not sleeping alone. You're sharing space with family members, possibly servants, maybe even a guest who arrived uninvited but refuses to leave. Beds are communal, warmth is shared, and personal space is more of a philosophical concept than a physical reality. You might wake up to someone snoring, someone moving, or someone stealing what little blanket you have. And yet this is normal, expected even. Because in your world, sleep isn't about comfort, it's about getting through the night. So you settle into your slightly upright position, adjust your layers, ignore the sounds around you, and close your eyes. Not fully relaxed, not fully horizontal, but just enough to convince your body that this is acceptable. And if you make it to morning, well, congratulations. You slept without accidentally resembling a corpse, which, in Tudor terms, is a success. As you step out into the streets of Tudor England, you're not just walking, you're preparing for battle. Not against people, not against animals, but against something far more dangerous, the air itself. Because in your world, air isn't just air. It's a potential threat, a silent, invisible enemy filled with disease, rot, and everything your body would prefer not to interact with. So naturally, you don't leave your house unprotected. Around your neck, or in your hand, you carry a pomander, a small, often decorative container filled with herbs, spices, and strong perfumes. It might look elegant, even fashionable, but make no mistake. This is your version of a survival tool. Inside, you'll find things like rosemary, cloves, musk, or ambergris, scents that are strong enough to overpower whatever the city is currently producing, which on most days is not pleasant. The logic is simple. If bad smells cause illness, then good smells must prevent it. So as you walk through crowded streets, past markets, animals, and things you'd rather not identify, you periodically lift your pomander closer to your face, breathing in deeply, not because you enjoy it, although it's definitely an improvement, but because you believe it's actively protecting you. You are essentially filtering reality. And honestly, when you consider the environment, this doesn't feel entirely unreasonable. Streets are narrow, waste disposal is more of a suggestion than a system, and the combination of heat, animals, and human activity creates an atmosphere that could politely be described as aggressive. So yes, the idea that smell equals danger makes sense to you. Strong smell? Strong danger. Pleasant smell? Possibly safe. It's not scientific, but it's consistent. And consistency is comforting. Pomanders also become status symbols. The richer you are, the more elaborate your pomander. Gold, silver, intricate designs. Because nothing says, I am important, like surviving the air more elegantly than everyone else. Of course, from a modern perspective, this doesn't actually protect you from disease, but it does protect you from something equally immediate. The overwhelming smell of daily life. And in a city where every breath is a gamble, even the illusion of control feels valuable. So you hold your pomander close, take another cautious breath, and continue walking, confident that as long as the world smells acceptable, you might just live through it. When it's time to eat, you don't reach for a fork, mostly because it doesn't exist for you in any meaningful way. Instead, you rely on what you were born with, your hands, a knife, and a very strong sense of social awareness. Because eating isn't just about food. It's about not embarrassing yourself in front of everyone else who is also eating with their hands. You sit down at the table, or something that resembles a table, and the food is placed before you, often shared among multiple people. Personal plates are rare. Privacy, once again, is just a rumour. But don't get too comfortable. There are rules. You don't just grab food like a hungry animal. You use 3 fingers, typically your thumb, index, and middle finger. Using your whole hand would be considered uncivilized, which is ironic considering everything else happening around you. You take small portions, carefully selecting pieces without touching too much of the shared food. Because while hygiene isn't exactly modern, there is still a line, and you're expected not to cross it. Your knife is your main tool. You cut pieces, assist your hand, and occasionally defend your dignity. Spoons exist, but mainly for soups or softer foods. Forks? Those are still viewed with suspicion in many places. Unnecessarily fancy, slightly foreign, and possibly trying too hard. Then there's the trencher. Instead of a plate, you're often given a thick slice of stale bread. This acts as your surface for food, soaking up juices, holding meat, and absorbing whatever falls from your careful attempts at coordination. By the end of the meal, the trencher has done most of the hard work. And then comes the interesting part. That bread, now fully saturated with everything your meal had to offer, might be eaten or given to someone poorer. which means your plate is either your final course or someone else's dinner. A beautiful system, depending on how you look at it. You also have to be mindful of your behaviour. No licking your fingers excessively. No reaching across people. No taking the best pieces unless your status allows it. And if it does, congratulations, you're the problem. Meals are social, structured, and surprisingly disciplined. So as you sit there, carefully picking up your food with exactly 3 fingers, trying not to touch anything you shouldn't, you realise something important. This isn't just eating, it's a performance. And if you get it wrong, people will notice. When you get thirsty in the Tudor era, you don't reach for water with confidence. You look at it, evaluate it, and then quietly decide you'd rather not take that risk. Because water in your world is suspicious. It looks innocent enough, but you know better. Rivers carry waste, wells can be contaminated, and anything that seems too clear is probably hiding something unpleasant. Drinking straight water feels like trusting a stranger who smiles a bit too much. So instead you drink beer, not the kind that sends you into poor decisions and emotional speeches. This is small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew consumed throughout the day. And when I say throughout the day, I mean constantly, morning, midday, evening. Hydration is a full-time commitment. Children drink it. Adults drink it. If you can hold a cup, you're participating. And surprisingly, this is one of the smarter habits you have. Brewing beer involves boiling the liquid, which, unknown to you, kills a lot of harmful things living in the water. You don't know about bacteria, but you do know one thing. Beer doesn't make you sick as often as water does. So from your perspective, the choice is obvious. Water is risky. Beer is reliable. You're not trying to get drunk. You're trying to survive without your stomach declaring war on you. Of course, this does mean that a light, constant buzz is just part of daily life. Not enough to impair you, but enough to make everything slightly more tolerable. Which, considering your environment, is more of a feature than a problem. Meals are accompanied by ale. Work breaks include it. Even casual conversation tends to happen over a cup of something fermented. It's less of a drink and more of a background condition. And if you're wealthier, your options improve. Better quality ale, stronger brews, even imported wines. But regardless of status, the principle remains the same. If it's been boiled and fermented, it's safer than trusting plain water. You also don't have the luxury of refrigeration, so everything is consumed relatively quickly. Freshness matters, not for taste, but for avoiding unpleasant consequences later. So you raise your cup, take a drink, and continue your day. Not because you're celebrating, but because staying hydrated without dying requires a bit of creativity. And in your world, that creativity comes with a slight buzz. Getting dressed in the Tudor era isn't a quick decision. It's a commitment, a process, a slow realization that by the time you're finished, you've created a personal climate system around your body. Because you don't just wear clothes, you wear layers. Many layers. First comes your linen shirt, sitting close to your skin. This is the most important piece. Not because it looks good, but because it does all the work. It absorbs sweat, oils, and whatever your body produces throughout the day. Think of it as your first line of defense, and also your only line of hygiene. Then come the additional layers: wool garments, doublets, gowns, cloaks, each one adding weight, warmth, and a growing sense that you may have overcommitted. By the time you're fully dressed, you're less a person and more a carefully assembled structure. And yes, it can get hot. Very hot. Especially if you're moving, working, or existing anywhere near a fire. Which, unfortunately, is most places. But removing layers isn't always an option. Clothing reflects your status, your respectability, and your general willingness to follow social rules. If you start taking things off too casually, people will notice. And not in a good way. So you endure. The logic behind all of this is surprisingly practical. Since you're not bathing regularly, your linen undergarments take on the responsibility of keeping you clean. They trap sweat and dirt, which means as long as you change them often enough, you can maintain the illusion of hygiene. The outer layers? Those don't get washed nearly as often. They're expensive, delicate, and frankly, no one wants to deal with that process more than necessary. So instead, you protect them. The inner layers take the damage, the outer layers maintain appearances, and you exist somewhere in between, hoping for a breeze that may never come. There's also warmth to consider. Tudor buildings are not exactly known for insulation. Drafts find you. Cold finds you. So layering isn't just about cleanliness, it's about survival during colder months. Still, there are moments, especially in warmer weather, when you begin to question everything. Your choices, your outfit, your entire society. But you carry on, because in your world, being slightly uncomfortable, slightly overheated and slightly trapped in your own clothing is completely normal. And as long as your linen is clean, everything else is technically fine. When evening arrives and the light begins to fade, you don't think, finally, some fresh air. You think, time to seal this place like we're under attack. Because in your world, night air is dangerous, not slightly uncomfortable, not a bit chilly. Dangerous. The kind of dangerous that slips quietly into your room, settles around you while you sleep, and decides your fate without asking permission. You've been taught that cooler air carries disease more easily. That darkness somehow strengthens whatever invisible forces are already floating around during the day. So when night falls, the outside air doesn't feel refreshing. It feels suspicious. So you close everything. Windows stay shut. Doors stay closed. Any crack that might let air in is treated like a problem that needs immediate solving. Your room becomes sealed, contained, and gradually less breathable. But to you, this feels safe. Because inside air is familiar. It's already been breathed, already been lived in. Nothing new is entering. Nothing unknown. And in a time where unknown often means potentially fatal, that's a comforting thought. Of course, this creates an environment that modern standards would describe as challenging. The air becomes warm, heavy, and filled with everything that happens when humans occupy a closed space for hours. Fires may still be burning, adding smoke into the mix. Multiple people might be sleeping in the same room, contributing their own presence. Freshness is not the goal. Stability is. And if the room starts to feel slightly suffocating, well, that's a small price to pay for not inviting in whatever horrors might be lurking outside. There are even additional precautions. You might hang fabrics, use herbs, or burn scented materials to clean the air inside. Not because it actually removes anything harmful, but because it smells better. And if it smells better, it must be safer. That's the logic, and you're sticking to it. So as you settle in for the night, you make sure everything is closed, secured, and exactly as it should be. No drafts, no fresh air, no surprises. Just you, your carefully contained atmosphere, and the quiet confidence that nothing from outside can reach you. Which, in your mind, is the whole point. Because in the Tudor era, survival isn't about breathing better. It's about breathing predictably. When you wake up in the Tudor era, you don't reach for a toothbrush, because that doesn't exist yet in any form you would recognize. No minty gel, no electric buzzing, no reassuring promise of 12-hour protection. Just you, and whatever you can improvise. But that doesn't mean you ignore your teeth. On the contrary, you're expected to keep them reasonably clean. Mostly so other people don't immediately regret standing near you. So you work with what you have. You might take a small cloth and rub your teeth manually, like you're polishing something you don't fully understand. Or you use a twig, sometimes chewed at the end to create a rough brush, gently scrubbing away whatever yesterday left behind. It's not elegant, but it's effort, and effort counts. If you're feeling particularly advanced, you might use a powder. These can be made from crushed herbs, salt, charcoal, or other substances that feel like they should be helpful. Some of them actually are, others are aggressively enthusiastic. Either way, your mouth gets cleaned, or at least something happens that qualifies as cleaning. Of course, your diet isn't doing you any favors. Sugar is becoming more common, especially if you're wealthier. Sweet foods are a luxury, a sign that you're doing well in life. Unfortunately, they also quietly destroy your teeth. And here's where things take a strange turn. Blackened teeth, caused by decay from sugar, can actually become a status symbol. If your teeth look damaged, it shows you can afford sugar, which means people might look at your smile and think, impressive, financially successful, possibly in pain but successful. So instead of hiding it, some people lean into it. Appearance isn't about health, it's about what your health says about your wealth. Dental pain, of course, is still very real, and when that happens, your options are limited. There are no dentists as you know them, just practitioners who might pull a tooth if necessary, with varying levels of confidence. So prevention becomes your best strategy. Clean what you can, how you can, and hope for the best. As you finish your morning routine, wiping your teeth with a cloth and convincing yourself this is perfectly adequate, you take a moment to appreciate one thing. You're trying, and in the Tudor era, that already puts you ahead of schedule. When you feel unwell in the Tudor era, you don't panic immediately. You pause, consider your symptoms, and then make a decision that feels both responsible and slightly dangerous. You go see a doctor. Now this sounds reassuring. Someone trained, someone knowledgeable, someone who can help you understand what's happening inside your body. Unfortunately, what's happening inside your body is not nearly as concerning as what's about to happen to it, because Tudor medicine is based on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. According to this system, your entire health depends on keeping these in perfect balance. And if you're sick, it means something is out of alignment. So naturally, the solution is to remove things from your body. You arrive, explain your symptoms. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you have a fever. Maybe you just made the mistake of existing near other people. And the doctor listens carefully, nods thoughtfully, then decides the best course of action is bloodletting, which means you are now losing blood. On purpose. Leeches might be involved. Or a blade. Either way, the idea is that by removing excess blood, your body will rebalance itself. It sounds dramatic because it is, but to you it makes sense. The theory is widely accepted, and questioning it would require knowledge that simply doesn't exist yet. And if bloodletting doesn't fix the problem, there are other options. You might be given herbs, tonics, or mixtures that taste like they were invented as a punishment. Some of these remedies are harmless. Some are helpful. Others are memorable in ways you didn't ask for. There's also purging, encouraging your body to expel whatever is causing the imbalance, which means your day is about to take a very different direction. But here's the important part. You trust this process because it's structured. It's based on theory. It gives you the feeling that something is being done. And in a world where illness can appear suddenly and end things just as quickly, that feeling matters. Of course, from a modern perspective, many of these treatments do more harm than good. But you don't have that perspective. You have belief, tradition, and the hope that this person knows what they're doing. So you sit there, letting the process unfold, convincing yourself that this is the path back to health. And if you survive both the illness and the treatment, well, clearly it worked. When something goes wrong in your body, a headache, a fever, a cough that sounds slightly dramatic, you don't reach for a pharmacy, you reach for plants. Because in your world, herbs are medicine. Not maybe helpful, not nice addition, but essential. They are your treatments, your preventatives, and occasionally your last line of defense when things have already gone very wrong. You've grown up learning this. Recipes, mixtures, little bits of knowledge passed down from parents, neighbours, or that one person who insists they know everything because they once spoke to someone who almost became a doctor. So when you feel unwell, you act. Rosemary for memory and clarity, sage for wisdom and general health, mint for digestion, lavender for calming. Everything has a purpose and, more importantly, everything has a reputation. Whether it works or not is secondary. You prepare mixtures carefully, crushing leaves, boiling roots, blending ingredients that smell either comforting or slightly alarming. The result is usually a drink, a paste, or something you apply directly to your skin while hoping for the best. Some of it actually helps. Certain herbs do have real medicinal properties, even if you don't fully understand why. And through observation, trial, error, and a bit of luck, people have figured out combinations that provide genuine relief. But then there are the other remedies, the ones that seem convincing until you think about them for more than 3 seconds. Mixtures that are too strong, too strange, or clearly invented during a moment of overconfidence, and yet you still try them. Because doing something feels better than doing nothing. Herbs are also part of daily life, not just emergencies. You use them in cooking, in cleaning, even in attempts to improve the air around you. They're everywhere, hanging, drying, stored, carried, and they give you a sense of control. In a world where illness can appear without warning and explanations are limited, having something you can prepare, measure, and use feels reassuring. Even if the results are inconsistent, the process itself is comforting. So you gather what you need, prepare your remedy, and take it, or apply it, with quiet confidence. Because in your world, healing doesn't come from laboratories. It comes from the earth. And occasionally, from guessing correctly. When night comes and it's time to sleep, you don't think, finally, some privacy. You think, all right, who am I sharing this with tonight? Because in the Tudor era, a bed is not a personal space. It's a shared resource, a warm, slightly questionable human storage unit. If you're fortunate, you have a bed at all. That already puts you ahead. But even then, it's rarely just yours. You share it with family members, possibly siblings, maybe a servant, and occasionally someone who just ended up there. Travel was unpredictable, hospitality was expected, and saying no wasn't always an option. So you make room. Beds are expensive. The frame, the mattress, often stuffed with straw, feathers, or something that used to be alive. The blankets. It's not practical for everyone to have their own. So instead, you fit as many people as reasonably possible into one space. Reasonably, of course, is doing a lot of work here. You lie down, slightly upright as previously discussed, and immediately become aware of everyone else. Someone shifts, someone snores, someone breathes a little too enthusiastically, and there's always that one person who slowly, confidently takes more blanket than they started with. You notice. You accept it. You suffer quietly, because this is normal. There's also a practical side to it. Sharing a bed means sharing warmth, which is extremely valuable when your home isn't exactly known for insulation. Nights can be cold and body heat becomes a group effort. So yes, comfort is compromised. Personal space is non-existent, but survival, slightly improved. And then there are inns. If you're traveling, things get even more interesting. You might share a bed with complete strangers, people you've never met, may never see again, and would probably not choose to sleep next to under any other circumstances. But again, this is accepted. You lie there, staring into the darkness, aware of the presence of others, trying not to think too much about it. Because thinking too much leads to questions, and questions don't help you sleep. So you adjust your position, hold onto whatever portion of blanket you've managed to secure, and close your eyes. Not because it's comfortable, but because eventually exhaustion wins. And in the Tudor era, that's usually how things get resolved. When you get dressed in the Tudor era, you don't stop at clothes. You complete the process with something equally important, your hat. And once it's on, it tends to stay on. Indoors, outdoors, during meals, during conversations. Your head is officially covered, and that's how it's going to remain. Because in your world, a hat isn't optional. It's not just about warmth or style. It's about identity, respectability, and following rules that no one is interested in questioning. In fact, there are actual laws about it. You're expected to wear certain types of headwear depending on your status. Materials, shapes, and styles can reflect who you are, or at least who you're allowed to be. If you're of a lower class, your options are limited. If you're wealthier, your hat becomes more elaborate, more structured, and significantly more difficult to ignore. So when you put it on, you're not just finishing your outfit, you're announcing yourself, and removing it at the wrong time. That could be seen as disrespectful, not wearing one at all. Even worse, it suggests you're careless, improper, or simply not paying attention to the social rules everyone else is trying very hard to follow. So you keep it on, yes, even indoors, even when it's warm, even when it feels unnecessary, because comfort isn't really part of the equation. Appearance is. And appearance matters more than how you feel about it. There's also a practical side, at least in theory. Hats protect your head from dirt, from weather, from whatever might fall from above, which, depending on where you are, is a legitimate concern. But mostly it's about conformity. You look around, and everyone else is wearing one. Different styles, different materials, but the same idea. Covered heads, consistent expectations, and a shared understanding that this is just how things are done. So you adjust your hat slightly, making sure it sits correctly, not too loose, not too tight. You carry on with your day, fully aware that this small piece of clothing is doing more than just keeping your head warm. It's keeping you socially acceptable. And in the Tudor era, that's worth a little discomfort. When it's time to eat, you're not just thinking about taste or hunger. You're thinking about balance. Because in your world, food isn't just fuel. It's medicine, philosophy, and occasionally a gamble. Everything you eat is believed to have qualities, hot or cold, dry or moist, and your body, like everything else in Tudor thinking, needs to stay in perfect balance between these forces. So when you sit down to a meal, you're not just deciding what you want, you're deciding what your body can handle without falling into chaos. If you've been feeling sluggish, maybe that's too much cold in your system. If you're overheated or restless, perhaps you've had too many hot foods, and now it's your responsibility to correct that, preferably before your body decides to make things worse. This means meals are carefully interpreted. Meat, for example, is often considered hot and dry. Fruits might be cold and moist. Spices? Very hot, possibly too hot depending on who you ask. So you combine foods in ways that feel balanced, even if they seem strange. You don't question it. This is how you've been taught. So if someone tells you not to eat certain foods together, you listen. Not because it's a suggestion, but because it could affect your health in ways you don't fully understand. And that's exactly what makes it convincing. Cooking methods also matter. Roasting, boiling, baking. Each one changes the nature of the food. So preparing a meal isn't just about making it edible. It's about transforming it into something your body can accept without complaint. And then there are personal rules. You might avoid certain foods at specific times of day. You might eat differently depending on the season. Winter calls for warmth. Summer demands cooling. Your diet shifts constantly, not because of preference, but because of theory. Of course, from a modern perspective, none of this aligns with how nutrition actually works. But to you it feels logical, structured, predictable. It gives you a sense of control over your health in a world where very little is certain. So you choose your food carefully, balancing flavors, textures, and invisible qualities, hoping you've made the right combination. Because in the Tudor era, eating isn't just about staying alive. It's about staying balanced. And if that means avoiding certain foods for reasons no one can fully explain, then so be it. Better safe than mysteriously unbalanced. From the moment you wake up to the moment you try to fall asleep, slightly upright of course, your day is wrapped in prayer. Not occasionally, not just on special occasions, constantly. Because in your world, prayer isn't just a religious act. It's a routine. A habit as normal as eating, as necessary as breathing, and arguably more important than both. You begin your morning with it. Before you even fully trust your body to function properly, you acknowledge something higher. You give thanks for surviving the night, which, considering the risks of simply existing, feels like a reasonable achievement. Then before meals you pray again, not just out of gratitude, but because food itself is uncertain. Illness can come from anywhere, and what you're about to eat may or may not agree with you. So you take a moment, say the words, and hope for the best. After meals, another prayer, just in case. Throughout the day, if something goes wrong, a sudden pain, bad news, even a strange feeling you can't explain, you turn to prayer again. It's immediate, instinctive, like reaching for something familiar when everything else feels unpredictable. Because life for you is unpredictable. Disease appears without warning. Accidents happen quickly. People you know can be fine one day and gone the next. And there's very little you can do to control any of it. So prayer becomes your sense of control. It gives structure to your day. It gives meaning to events that don't make sense. And perhaps most importantly, it gives you the feeling that you're not facing everything alone. Even in public, prayer is visible. Churches are central to daily life. Bells ring, calling people to pause, to reflect, to participate. Religion isn't separate from society, it is society. And not participating? That's not really an option. So you pray when you wake, when you eat, when you worry, when you're grateful, and when you're afraid. You repeat words you've known your entire life, sometimes without thinking, sometimes with complete focus. Because whether you understand everything or not, one thing is clear. Prayer is part of how you survive. It doesn't guarantee safety. It doesn't prevent illness. But it gives you something to hold on to in a world that doesn't offer many guarantees. And as the day ends, you pray one last time, not out of habit, but out of hope. Hoping that when you close your eyes tonight, you'll wake up again tomorrow and get to do it all over again. By now, you've built your entire day around habits that feel normal to you. Avoiding baths, sleeping upright, sealing windows, balancing foods, carrying herbs, drinking beer like it's a hydration strategy designed by questionable logic. And yet, despite all of it, there's one thing you can't ignore. Life is fragile, not in a poetic, distant way. Not something you reflect on occasionally. It's immediate, constant, sitting quietly in the background of everything you do. You see it often. People fall ill suddenly. A cough turns serious. A fever lingers longer than it should. Someone who was perfectly fine yesterday is now not part of the conversation anymore. And there's rarely a clear explanation. No tests. No diagnoses that give you certainty. Just guesses, theories, and the hope that whatever is happening will pass. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So you adapt. All the habits you follow, even the strange ones, start to make sense when you realize what they're trying to do. They're not about perfection. They're about control, about creating some kind of order in a world that doesn't offer much of it. You avoid baths because you believe it keeps danger out. You close windows because you think it protects you. You eat carefully, dress carefully, behave carefully. Not because you're overly cautious, but because caution feels like your only advantage. Even small routines matter. The way you prepare your food, the way you arrange your sleeping position, the way you carry your herbs, say your prayers, choose your clothing. Each action is a quiet attempt to tip the balance slightly in your favor. And sometimes that's enough. Other times it isn't. But you don't have the luxury of stepping back and analyzing everything. You don't have access to knowledge that explains what's really happening. You work with what you have, and what you have is belief, tradition, and observation. So you continue. You wake up each day, follow your routines, make your choices, and hope they lead you safely to the next morning. Not guaranteed, not certain, and just possible. And strangely, that's enough to keep going. Because in your world, survival isn't about eliminating risk. It's about living alongside it. Quietly, carefully, and with just enough confidence to face another day. And if you make it through, then everything you did, every strange habit, every careful decision, feels like it mattered, even if it didn't. Because belief, in the Tudor era, is sometimes the only protection you have. You stand in front of her, expecting answers. After all, this is the most famous painting in the world. Surely, after 500 years of admiration, analysis, and mild obsession, someone must have figured her out by now. But within seconds, you realize something unsettling. This is not a face that wants to be understood. Her smile appears, soft and almost polite, like she's humoring you. Then, without warning, it slips away. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to make you question whether it was ever there at all. You lean in slightly, as if proximity might force honesty out of oil and wood. It does not. Instead, the illusion deepens. This is not an accident. Leonardo da Vinci knew exactly what he was doing, which is frankly unfair. While most artists were busy making people look vaguely human, Leonardo was out here manipulating your brain like it's a Renaissance science experiment. The secret lies in something called sfumato, a technique so subtle it feels like cheating. He avoided sharp lines, especially around the mouth and eyes, blending tones so smoothly that your vision can't lock onto a single expression. Your peripheral vision sees shadows that suggest a smile, but when you try to focus on it directly, those shadows dissolve. So now you're stuck in a loop. Look at her mouth, no smile. Look away slightly, there it is again. Look back, gone. At this point, you're not analysing a painting. The painting is analysing you, and it gets worse. Because your brain, desperate for patterns, begins filling in emotional meaning. Is she amused? Secretive? Mocking you, perhaps? You start projecting thoughts onto her, like a one-sided conversation where she refuses to speak, but somehow always has the last word. Leonardo didn't just paint a woman, he painted ambiguity itself. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The smile doesn't change. You do. Your perception shifts, your expectations adjust, your brain tries to resolve what it cannot fully understand, and in doing so, it creates the illusion of movement, emotion, life. So as you stand there, staring into that quiet, impossible face, you begin to realize something deeply inconvenient. The mystery of her smile was never meant to be solved. It was meant to keep you looking. For all the mystery surrounding the painting, the identity of the woman has long been debated, argued over, and occasionally turned into intellectual combat. For centuries, theories multiplied, some imaginative, others borderline desperate. A noble woman, a courtesan, a disguised self-portrait of Leonardo himself, which, to be fair, says more about modern curiosity than Renaissance reality. But today, most historians agree on a far less dramatic answer. The woman is believed to be Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a wealthy Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. Not a queen, not a myth, just a woman living an ordinary life in Florence. Though ordinary loses meaning when Leonardo da Vinci decides to paint you. The painting itself even carries her name in Italian, La Gioconda. Yet even this identification doesn't settle things. It only deepens the unease. Because if she was simply a merchant's wife, why does her presence feel so deliberate, so composed? She does not appear shy nor overly formal. There is no jewellery to display wealth, no dramatic clothing to command attention. Instead, she sits quietly, almost modestly, yet somehow dominates the entire space. Leonardo made choices here, and none of them were accidental. Her posture is calm, balanced, almost timeless. Her hands are folded with unnatural precision, resting as if they've been placed there by design rather than comfort. Even the background, with its strange, dreamlike landscapes, doesn't match reality. Roads lead nowhere. Rivers twist without purpose. The horizon itself feels slightly off, as though the world behind her doesn't fully exist. She is grounded, but the world around her is not. And then there's her expression. Not exaggerated, not symbolic, but unsettlingly subtle. It lacks the rigid seriousness common in portraits of the time. Instead, it suggests awareness. Not emotion exactly, but something closer to observation. As if she knows she is being watched. If this truly is Lisa Gherardini, then Leonardo did not simply paint her likeness. He transformed her into something more abstract, an idea rather than a person, a controlled presence that resists interpretation, and perhaps that's where the real mystery begins. Because identifying her name answers the smallest possible question, it does nothing to explain why she still feels unknowable. If the identity of the woman raises questions, the story of the painting itself makes things even stranger. Because unlike most commissions of the time, this one was never delivered. Leonardo da Vinci began working on the Mona Lisa around the early 16th century, likely commissioned by Francesco del Giocondo. Under normal circumstances, the process would have been straightforward. Paint the portrait, present it to the client, receive payment, and move on. Leonardo did none of that. Instead, he kept the painting with him for years. Not months, years. Possibly even decades. It followed him as he travelled across Italy, and eventually to France, where he spent the final years of his life. When he died, the painting was still in his possession, which raises an uncomfortable question. Why? One explanation is simple. Leonardo never considered it finished. He was known for this habit, starting projects, refining them endlessly, and often leaving them incomplete. Perfection, for him, was not a goal, but a moving target that could never quite be reached. But the Mona Lisa doesn't feel unfinished. In fact, it feels too complete, too deliberate to be abandoned by accident. Another possibility is that this painting was never meant to be just a commission. Over time, it may have become something else entirely. A personal experiment. A study of human expression, perception, and illusion. A canvas where Leonardo could test ideas that went beyond portraiture. This would explain the obsessive refinement, the layers of thin glazes, applied slowly over years, created an effect that was almost alive. Light doesn't simply sit on the surface. It seems to pass through it. The transitions are so smooth that the face appears to shift depending on how it is viewed. It wasn't just a portrait anymore. It was a problem Leonardo kept trying to solve, and perhaps he never believed he had. There is also a more subtle, almost unsettling theory that Leonardo formed a kind of attachment to the painting, not in a sentimental way, but in the sense that it represented something he could not replicate elsewhere. A perfect balance of art and science, emotion and control. Letting it go would have meant closing that chapter, so he didn't. Instead, the Mona Lisa remained with him until the end. Not as a finished product, but as a work in progress. One that outlived its creator. And in doing so, it became something rare. A masterpiece that was never truly completed. Behind her, the world refuses to behave. At first glance, the background appears like a distant countryside. Soft hills, winding rivers, a few lonely paths stretching into nowhere. It feels calm, almost peaceful. But the longer one looks, the more it begins to fall apart. Nothing quite aligns. The horizon on the left side sits noticeably lower than the one on the right. It's subtle, but once seen it cannot be ignored. The result is disorienting. Her face seems stable, centered, grounded, while the world behind her tilts slightly out of balance, like reality itself has shifted. This is not a mistake. Leonardo was deeply obsessed with nature, its structure, its chaos, its hidden patterns. He studied rivers, erosion, the way water carved through land over time. And in the Mona Lisa, that knowledge shows up in strange ways. The rivers twist unnaturally. The roads seem to lead nowhere. The mountains fade into a mist that feels less like distance and more like uncertainty. It's not a real place. It's a constructed one. A landscape assembled from observation, but rearranged into something almost dreamlike. Something that exists just outside the rules of the physical world. And because of that, it creates tension. The viewer tries to recognize it, to map it, to understand where they are. But the more they try, the less it makes sense. Meanwhile, she sits perfectly still in the foreground, untouched by the instability behind her. It creates a quiet contrast. She is controlled. The world is not. Some historians believe Leonardo used this background to reflect the connection between humanity and nature, how both are complex, evolving, and impossible to fully understand. Others suggest something more psychological, that the landscape mirrors the inner world of the subject, a visual representation of thoughts, emotions, or even subconscious movement. But there's also a simpler, more unsettling interpretation. The background exists to make her feel more real. By placing a figure of perfect balance in front of a world that feels slightly wrong, Leonardo forces the viewer to focus on her as the only stable element in the scene. The eye returns to her again and again, searching for certainty. And yet certainty never arrives, because while the landscape may be strange, it does not hide what it is. She does. And in a painting already filled with subtle distortions, that may be the most deliberate choice of all. What makes the Mona Lisa feel alive is not just the subject, or the mystery, or even the expression. It is the way it was painted. Leonardo did not approach this portrait like other artists of his time. While many relied on clear outlines and bold contrasts, he did the opposite. He erased the boundaries. He softened everything. Edges dissolve into shadows, shadows melt into light, and forms emerge without ever fully separating from their surroundings. The result is unsettling, because the human eye depends on edges to understand the world. Sharp lines tell the brain where one thing ends and another begins. Without them, perception becomes unstable. Shapes feel less fixed, less certain. Leonardo understood this, and used it deliberately. Through countless thin layers of paint, applied over long periods of time, he created transitions so gradual they are almost invisible. There are no harsh borders around the lips, no clear lines defining the eyes. Instead, everything is built from subtle shifts in tone. This is what gives the face its strange quality. It doesn't sit still. The expression seems to change depending on lighting, distance, and focus. Under one glance, the face appears calm and composed. Under another, something more elusive appears, something harder to define. It is not movement in a physical sense, but it feels like movement nonetheless. Almost like the painting is adjusting itself in response to the viewer. This effect is not accidental. It comes from a deep understanding of both anatomy and optics. Leonardo studied how light interacts with skin, how shadows form across muscles, how vision itself interprets what it sees. He wasn't just painting a face, he was recreating the process of seeing. And that is where things become uncomfortable, because the Mona Lisa doesn't behave like a static image. It behaves more like a visual experience, one that depends on the observer to complete it. The painting is not finished until someone looks at it, and even then, it never settles into a single version. Every viewer sees something slightly different. Every moment produces a new interpretation. The same face, the same features, yet never the same expression twice. In this sense, Leonardo did something rare. He created a painting that does not exist in one fixed state. It exists in flux. And once that becomes clear, the mystery deepens. Not because the painting is hiding something, but because it refuses to stay the same long enough to be understood. For centuries the painting was admired, but not worshipped. It hung quietly in royal collections, later in the museum of the Louvre Museum, respected among many masterpieces, but not yet elevated above them. It was known, certainly, appreciated, studied, but it was not the painting. That changed in one moment. In 1911, the Mona Lisa disappeared. No dramatic heist, no shattered glass, no alarms screaming through marble halls. It simply vanished. For over a day, no one even noticed. Visitors passed the empty space where she had been displayed, assuming it had been removed for photography or maintenance. Then reality settled in. The painting was gone. Panic followed. The museum shut down. Borders tightened. Newspapers exploded with headlines. The theft became an international sensation, not just because of what was stolen, but because of how impossible it seemed. How does one steal the most recognizable painting in France and walk out unnoticed? The answer, ironically, was simplicity. The thief, a man named Vincenzo Peruggia, was not a criminal mastermind. He was a former employee of the Louvre. He knew the building, the routines, the blind spots. On the morning of the theft, he entered the museum like any worker, removed the painting from its frame, hid it under his clothing, and walked out. No chaos, no resistance, just quiet confidence. For 2 years, the Mona Lisa was missing. During that time, something unexpected happened. Crowds began gathering, not to see the painting, but to see the empty space where it had once been. The absence became a spectacle. The mystery grew larger than the artwork itself. When the painting was finally recovered in Italy, the world had changed. It was no longer just a portrait. It was a legend. The theft transformed the Mona Lisa into something beyond art. It became a story, a global obsession, a symbol of intrigue and value. People who had never cared about Renaissance painting suddenly cared about this one, because it had been taken and then returned. From that moment on, the Mona Lisa was no longer just seen. It was recognized, not for what it showed, but for everything that had happened to it. After the painting returned to the Louvre Museum, something had changed permanently. It was no longer just admired, it was watched. Crowds began to form daily, not in small numbers but in waves. People travelled across countries, across continents, just to stand in front of a painting smaller than they expected. And when they arrived, something strange happened. They didn't stay long. A few seconds, a glance, a photo. Then they moved on. Yet the obsession never faded. This is the paradox of the Mona Lisa. It is one of the most viewed artworks in history, yet rarely one of the most deeply observed. People come to see it, but not always to study it. The experience becomes symbolic, proof of having been there, of having witnessed something important. But why this painting? There are technically more impressive works, larger ones, more detailed ones, more dramatic ones, and yet none have achieved the same level of fixation. Part of it lies in repetition. The Mona Lisa is everywhere, reproduced, reprinted, reinterpreted endlessly. It appears in textbooks, advertisements, parodies, souvenirs. Over time, it stops being just a painting and becomes an idea, a visual shorthand for art itself. And once something reaches that level, it becomes impossible to ignore. But there's something else beneath that surface. The painting never fully reveals itself. Even after centuries of study, there is no final answer to its questions, no definitive explanation for the smile, no complete certainty about its purpose, no single interpretation that satisfies everyone. Each generation approaches it with new theories, new tools, new perspectives, and still walks away with uncertainty. That uncertainty feeds the obsession, because people are drawn to what they cannot resolve. The brain dislikes unfinished puzzles, unanswered questions, incomplete meanings. It wants closure. The Mona Lisa denies it. So the cycle continues. Viewers arrive, searching for something. Clarity, emotion, understanding. They stand before the painting, hoping that this time perhaps it will make sense. And for a brief moment, it almost does. Then it slips away again. And that is enough to keep the world coming back. Not because the mystery is solved, but because it never is. Over the centuries, the Mona Lisa has not only been observed, it has been interrogated. Every detail has been pulled apart, examined, reconstructed, and questioned. and where certainty failed, theories rushed in to fill the silence. Some are grounded, others less so. One of the most persistent ideas suggests that the painting hides secrets beneath its surface. With modern technology, infrared scans, X-rays, digital reconstruction, researchers have discovered multiple underlying layers. Earlier versions of the portrait, slight shifts in posture, changes in the position of the hands, even subtle alterations to the expression. It was not painted once. It evolved. This has led some to believe that Leonardo was not capturing a single moment, but multiple moments layered together, a face built over time, not fixed in a single expression, but shaped through gradual transformation. Then there are the symbolic theories. Some claim hidden messages are embedded within the painting. Tiny letters in the eyes, coded references in the landscape, mathematical proportions linking the composition to universal patterns. Others argue that the painting represents an idealized concept rather than a real person. Not Lisa Gherardini, but a fusion of masculine and feminine traits, a visual balance between opposites, a kind of human equation. More extreme theories go further. Suggestions that the Mona Lisa is a disguised self-portrait of Leonardo himself, that the features, when mirrored or altered, align with known images of the artist. It is an idea that refuses to disappear, not because it is proven, but because it is compelling. And that is the key. The Mona Lisa invites interpretation without confirming any of it. Every theory, no matter how detailed, eventually reaches the same point: uncertainty. There is always something that cannot be verified, something that remains just out of reach. And instead of weakening the fascination, this lack of resolution strengthens it. Because the painting becomes a mirror. People see what they expect, what they want, what they are prepared to find. A historian sees context. A scientist sees technique. A conspiracy theorist sees hidden codes. An artist sees perfection. And none of them are entirely wrong. But none of them are entirely right either. The Mona Lisa absorbs interpretation without ever settling into one identity. And that is why the theories never die. They don't need to be true. They only need to be possible. After 5 centuries of questions, theories, and endless observation, one uncomfortable conclusion begins to take shape. The Mona Lisa was never meant to be solved. Every attempt to define her, her identity, her expression, her meaning, runs into the same quiet resistance. The painting allows interpretation, even encourages it, but never confirms anything. It gives just enough to provoke curiosity and then stops. That balance feels intentional. Leonardo da Vinci was not just painting a portrait. He was exploring perception itself. How humans see, how they interpret, how easily the mind fills in what it cannot fully grasp. The Mona Lisa becomes less about the woman in the frame and more about the person standing in front of it. Because the experience changes depending on who is looking. To one viewer, her smile feels calm and reassuring. To another, it feels distant, even unsettling. Some see kindness, others detect something almost knowing, as if she holds a secret she has no intention of sharing. The painting does not decide, the viewer does, and that is where the mystery truly lives. Not in the layers of paint, not in hidden symbols, not in historical records, but in the interaction between image and observer. It is a moving target, shaped by perception rather than fixed reality. Over time, the Mona Lisa has become more than a masterpiece. It has turned into a kind of test, one that quietly asks each person the same question: what do you see? There is no correct answer, and perhaps that is the point. In a world that constantly seeks conclusions, clarity, and certainty, the Mona Lisa remains stubbornly unresolved. It resists final explanations. It avoids closure. It exists in a state of permanent ambiguity, and because of that, it endures. Not as a problem to be solved, but as an experience to be repeated, again and again. Long after the names, the theories, and even the history begin to fade, the face remains, still watching, still shifting, still refusing to settle into anything permanent. A quiet reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be uncovered, only observed. Parachutes, armoured tanks, diving suits. Centuries before they became reality, they already existed. Not in metal, not in motion, but in ink. At the centre of it all stands Leonardo da Vinci, a man who did not simply belong to the Renaissance. He seemed to operate just slightly ahead of it, like someone working from a future no one else could yet see. While artists around him focused on beauty, proportion, and religious devotion, Leonardo was busy asking a different kind of question. What else is possible? His notebooks, filled with sketches, diagrams, and mirrored handwriting, reveal something deeply unusual. These were not idle doodles or abstract fantasies. They were engineered ideas, calculated, tested on paper, many of them detailed down to the smallest component, as if he expected someone, if not himself, to build them. And yet most of them were never constructed, not because they lacked imagination, but because the world around him lacked the tools. Materials were too weak, power sources too limited, precision manufacturing barely existed. Leonardo could design a flying machine, but he could not create an engine powerful enough to lift it. He could sketch an armoured vehicle, but the metallurgy of his time could not support its full potential. He was designing for a world that had not arrived yet, and that is where the tension begins, because these inventions sit in a strange space between brilliance and impossibility. Some designs are shockingly accurate, resembling machines that would only appear hundreds of years later. Others seem flawed, impractical, even naive, ideas that look impressive on parchment but collapse under real-world conditions. But dismissing them as failures misses the point entirely. Leonardo was not trying to produce finished machines. He was exploring principles: flight, pressure, motion, resistance, human interaction with environment. His inventions were less about immediate function and more about understanding how the world could work if pushed beyond its current limits. In a way, they were questions disguised as machines. And perhaps the most remarkable part is this: he documented everything. Every idea, every adjustment, every failed attempt. Not for an audience, not for recognition, but as if he were building a conversation with the future. A future that would eventually catch up. So when looking at these Renaissance inventions, it becomes clear that they are not just relics of curiosity. They are fragments of a mind that refused to stay within its own time. Among all the ideas sketched across Leonardo's notebooks, one obsession rises above the rest: flight. Not symbolic flight, not mythological wings or poetic imagination. Real, physical, human flight. The kind that would lift a body off the ground and carry it through the air like a bird. For centuries, this had been a fantasy. Leonardo treated it like a problem. He studied birds with unusual intensity. Not casually, but analytically. He observed how wings curved, how feathers adjusted mid-air, how the body shifted to control direction. He broke movement down into components: lift, drag, balance, long before those words became formal scientific terms. Then he tried to translate it. The result was a series of flying machine designs that feel strangely familiar today. Large, bat-like wings attached to a wooden frame, meant to be powered by human movement. The pilot would lie or stand within the structure, using arms and legs to generate motion, attempting to replicate the flapping of wings. It was ambitious and deeply flawed. The human body simply does not have the strength-to-weight ratio required for sustained flight. Even with perfect construction, the machine would struggle to leave the ground. Leonardo was attempting to solve a problem that required more than anatomy. It required technology that did not yet exist. But that didn't stop him. Over time, his designs evolved. He began moving away from flapping wings toward gliding concepts, understanding slowly that flight was not about mimicking birds exactly, but about working with air itself. He explored the idea of controlled descent, stability, and balance. This shift is where things become remarkable, because within these notes appears one of his most famous concepts: a parachute, a pyramid-shaped structure, designed to slow a fall from height. Unlike many of his other inventions, this one was not only possible, but functional. Centuries later, modern tests confirmed that his design could actually work. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but it worked. And that changes the perspective entirely. Leonardo was not simply imagining flight. He was approaching it from multiple angles. If humans could not yet sustain flight, they could at least control how they moved through the air. Descent before ascent. Control before power. It was a step forward. A small one, perhaps. But in a world where flight was still considered impossible, even that step was extraordinary. because it marked the moment when flight stopped being a dream and started becoming a system. If flight represented Leonardo's curiosity, war revealed something more complicated. Because alongside sketches of wings and parachutes, there exists another category of invention, one far less poetic: machines designed to destroy. During the Renaissance, warfare was evolving rapidly. Gunpowder had begun to reshape battlefields, and rulers were eager for any advantage that could tilt the balance in their favour. Leonardo understood this. More importantly, he knew how to present himself. When seeking employment, he did not lead with paintings. He led with weapons. In a famous letter to Ludovico Sforza, ruler of Milan, Leonardo da Vinci described his ability to design bridges, fortifications, and, most notably, war machines. He positioned himself not as an artist, but as a military engineer, and the designs he produced were unsettling. One of the most striking is the so-called tank, a circular, armoured vehicle covered in sloped plating, designed to deflect incoming attacks. Inside, multiple cannons would fire outward in all directions, allowing the machine to move into the centre of a battlefield and unleash destruction from within a protective shell. On paper, it looks shockingly modern, but there's a problem. The internal gearing system appears flawed. Deliberately so, according to some historians. If built exactly as drawn, the machine would struggle to move properly. Whether this was an oversight or an intentional safeguard remains unclear. And that ambiguity matters, because it raises a question about Leonardo's intentions. Was he fully committed to these designs, or was there hesitation beneath the surface? He worked for powerful patrons who expected results often tied to war. But at the same time, his notebooks reveal a mind deeply fascinated by life, nature, and harmony. Destruction feels out of place. Yet the ideas continue. Multi-barreled guns designed to fire in rapid succession. Giant crossbows capable of launching massive projectiles. Defensive fortifications engineered with precision. These were not abstract concepts. They were practical responses to the demands of his time. Leonardo was adapting. But whether he believed in these machines is harder to determine. Some see him as a visionary engineer responding to opportunity. Others see a man navigating survival, offering what patrons wanted, while quietly embedding limits within his designs. Either way, the result is the same. A collection of war machines that feel both ahead of their time and strangely restrained. Powerful in concept, but never fully unleashed. If the sky obsessed Leonardo and war demanded his attention, then water became something else entirely, a hidden world. While most people of the Renaissance saw water as an obstacle, something to cross, avoid, or survive, Leonardo da Vinci saw it as a system waiting to be understood. He studied its movement, its pressure, the way it flowed, crashed, and carved through land. But eventually, his focus shifted below the surface. What happens beneath? This question led to one of his most unusual ideas, a diving suit. The design appears simple at first glance. A leather suit, fitted tightly to the body, connected to long breathing tubes that extended up to the surface. These tubes were supported by floating devices, allowing air to travel down to the diver below. It was not elegant. It was not comfortable. But it was an attempt to solve a problem no one had seriously approached before. Sustained underwater presence, and like many of Leonardo's ideas, it came with a purpose. Venice, one of the great powers of the time, lived and died by water. Its canals were both defense and vulnerability. Leonardo proposed that divers could use these suits to move beneath enemy ships, cutting their hulls or sabotaging them from below. A silent threat. No cannons, no visible attack, just damage appearing from the depths. It was a different kind of warfare, one that relied on invisibility rather than force. But the design also reveals something deeper. Leonardo included details that suggest he understood the dangers involved. Reinforced joints to withstand pressure, air systems to maintain breathing, even concepts for emergency escape if something went wrong. He wasn't just imagining the possibility, he was anticipating failure. And yet, despite the ingenuity, the design was never fully realized. The materials of the time limited its effectiveness. The risks were immense. The control over air supply unreliable. It existed as a concept that could function in theory but struggled in practice. Still, the idea remained, because centuries later, the same principles would reappear in modern diving equipment. controlled air supply, flexible suits, human exploration beneath water. What Leonardo had imagined in leather and tubes would eventually become steel and precision engineering. Once again, the pattern repeats. An idea ahead of its time, a solution waiting for the future to catch up. And beneath the surface, just like above it, Leonardo had already been there first. Movement for Leonardo was never just about speed, it was about control. While many of his contemporaries focused on static structures, buildings, sculptures, fortifications, Leonardo da Vinci turned his attention to something more elusive. Motion without constant human effort. Machines that could move on their own. Among his most fascinating designs is a concept often described as a self-propelled cart. At first glance it appears simple, a wooden platform mounted on wheels, but hidden within it is a system of springs, gears, and braking mechanisms designed to store energy and release it in a controlled way. In effect, it was a programmable machine, before engines, before fuel systems, before the very concept of automation had a name. The cart could be wound up, like a mechanical device, and then set into motion. It would move forward, following a predetermined path, guided by adjustable settings within its mechanism. Not randomly, but intentionally. It didn't just move, it followed instructions. This is where Leonardo's thinking becomes particularly striking. He wasn't just solving mechanical problems. He was exploring the idea of systems that could operate independently of continuous human input, machines that could perform actions after being set in motion. A primitive form of automation, and it didn't stop there. His notebooks reveal intricate studies of gears, pulleys, and transmission systems. He analysed how force could be transferred, redirected, amplified, how one movement could trigger another, how complex sequences could emerge from simple mechanical interactions. In modern terms, he was studying the foundations of engineering logic. But once again, the limitations of the time intervened. Precision manufacturing did not exist at the level required to build these systems reliably. Springs would wear down, gears would misalign. Materials lacked the consistency needed for sustained operation. The ideas were sound, but the execution remained fragile. Still, the concepts endured. Centuries later, similar principles would appear in clockwork mechanisms, early robotics, and eventually automated machinery. The idea of storing energy and releasing it in a controlled sequence became fundamental to engineering. Leonardo had already mapped it out. And perhaps the most interesting part is this. These machines were not designed for survival, or war, or even necessity. They were experiments in possibility, proof that motion itself could be designed, controlled, and predicted. A quiet step toward a future where machines would no longer wait for human hands, but begin to act on their own. Behind every invention Leonardo imagined, there was something even more important than the machine itself. Understanding, Leonardo da Vinci did not separate art from engineering, or biology from mechanics. To him, everything moved according to principles, and if those principles could be understood, they could be recreated. This belief led him into one of his most intense pursuits, the study of the human body, not out of curiosity alone, but out of necessity. If machines were to move efficiently, they had to follow the same logic as living systems. Muscles, tendons, joints, these were not just biological features. They were mechanical solutions refined by nature over time. So Leonardo studied them. In secret, often at night, he dissected human bodies, mapping muscles layer by layer, tracing how they connected, how they contracted, how they generated motion. His drawings are not crude sketches. They are precise, almost clinical representations of structure and function. And from these studies, something began to emerge. A connection between body and machine. He noticed that tendons behaved like cables, transmitting force across distance. Joints functioned like pivots, allowing controlled rotation. The spine provided both stability and flexibility, balancing strength with movement. Every part had a purpose. Every movement had a cause. This was not random. It was design. And if nature could design systems this efficient, then human-made machines could follow the same rules. This idea shaped many of his inventions. Mechanical limbs inspired by anatomy, devices that mimicked the motion of muscles. Even his studies of flight were influenced by how birds use their bodies to control air, not just their wings. He wasn't copying nature, he was decoding it. But there is also a deeper layer to this work, one that feels almost philosophical. Leonardo did not see the human body as separate from machines. He saw it as the original machine, the most complex system available for study. And that changes how his inventions are understood. They are not just tools. They are extensions of the same logic that governs life itself, which means that every gear, every lever, every moving part in his designs carries something more than function. It carries imitation, an attempt to recreate in wood and metal the silent mechanics of living systems. And in doing so, Leonardo blurred a line that had never truly been crossed before. The line between the natural and the artificial. For all their brilliance, many of Leonardo's machines shared a common problem. They could not exist, not in the world he lived in. Leonardo da Vinci could design mechanisms with extraordinary precision, but design alone was not enough. The Renaissance lacked something essential: technology capable of turning those ideas into reliable reality. Materials were the first limitation. Wood, leather, and early metals simply could not handle the stresses Leonardo's machines demanded. A flying machine required structures both strong and lightweight, something impossible with the materials available at the time. Armoured vehicles needed metal that could withstand impact without becoming too heavy to move. Even simple mechanical systems struggled with wear and tear. Then there was energy. Many of Leonardo's designs relied on human or animal power, but this created a fundamental constraint. The human body could only produce a limited amount of force, and many of his inventions required far more. His flying machines, for example, demanded sustained power output that no human could realistically provide. The designs worked in theory, but theory has limits. Precision posed another challenge. Leonardo's machines often depended on complex arrangements of gears and moving parts. For them to function properly, each component needed to be manufactured with accuracy. Yet Renaissance tools were not capable of producing parts with the consistency required. A small misalignment could stop everything, and often did, but perhaps the most interesting limitation was not physical. It was conceptual. Leonardo was thinking in systems that had not yet been fully understood. He was exploring aerodynamics before it had a name, studying fluid dynamics without formal equations, designing mechanisms that anticipated future engineering principles. In many cases, he was solving problems that had not even been defined yet. And that creates a strange contradiction, because his machines appear both advanced and incomplete at the same time. Some designs feel almost modern. Others seem impractical, even flawed. But those flaws often come from pushing beyond the knowledge of the era, not from a lack of intelligence. He was reaching into unknown territory, and sometimes that meant getting things wrong. But those failures carry their own importance. They reveal the boundary between imagination and reality, the exact point where an idea becomes too advanced for its time. Leonardo stood at that boundary constantly, testing it, stretching it, occasionally crossing it, even when nothing could be built, even when the world wasn't ready. His inventions may not have existed physically, but intellectually, they were already there. Long after his death, Leonardo's machines did something unexpected. They waited. His notebooks, thousands of pages filled with sketches, diagrams, and dense observations, were not widely published during his lifetime. They remained scattered, hidden in private collections, misunderstood, or simply ignored. For years, even centuries, much of his work existed in silence. And yet, when rediscovered, something became clear. The future had already been drawn. Leonardo da Vinci had outlined concepts that would not become reality until hundreds of years later. Not perfectly, not always accurately, but close enough to feel unsettling. His parachute design? Tested centuries later, and it worked. His studies of flight? Echoed in the development of early gliders and, eventually, airplanes. His ideas about armoured vehicles? Reflected in modern tanks. Even his mechanical systems, gears, transmissions, automated motion, reappear in later engineering with striking familiarity. But this does not mean Leonardo invented these machines in the modern sense. What he did was something more subtle. He anticipated them. He identified the underlying principles before the world had the means to apply them. He saw patterns in nature, motion, and structure, and extended those patterns into possibilities. His work became a kind of blueprint, not for specific devices, but for ways of thinking. and that is where his true influence lies. Because invention is not just about building something new, it is about understanding what can be built. Leonardo's notebooks are filled with unfinished ideas, partial solutions, and experimental designs. But within that incompleteness lies their strength. They are not rigid conclusions, they are open frameworks waiting to be expanded, and eventually they were. Engineers, scientists, and inventors across centuries would unknowingly follow paths Leonardo had already explored, not by copying him directly, but by rediscovering the same principles through their own work. It is as if his ideas were seeds, planted early, left dormant, then slowly brought to life as technology caught up. This creates a strange relationship between past and future. The Renaissance is often seen as a rebirth of knowledge, but in Leonardo's case, it also became a projection forward, a glimpse of systems, machines, and possibilities that would only become real long after he was gone. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part. His inventions did not need to exist in his lifetime to matter, because they were never just about the present. They were messages, written in ink, and addressed to the future. In the end, Leonardo's machines leave behind a strange impression, not of completion, but of motion. Leonardo da Vinci did not build a legacy of finished inventions lined up neatly across history. He left something far less orderly and far more powerful. A trail of ideas, constantly moving, constantly evolving, never fully resolved. His work feels unfinished, and that is precisely why it endures. Most inventions are tied to their moment. They solve a problem, serve a purpose, and eventually become outdated. They belong to their time. But Leonardo's machines resist that pattern, because they were never confined to a single solution. They remain open, capable of being reinterpreted, rebuilt, or reimagined in different eras. They do not expire. They adapt. This is the difference between invention and vision. Leonardo was not focused on delivering final answers. He was focused on asking better questions. How can humans fly? How can movement be controlled? How can machines imitate life? These questions do not belong to the Renaissance. They extend far beyond it, and that gives his work a kind of permanence. Even today, his sketches still feel relevant. Not because they can be directly used, but because they point toward problems that continue to exist. Engineers refine them, scientists expand them, designers reinterpret them. The details change, but the core ideas remain. There is also something more human within this legacy. Leonardo's notebooks reveal a mind that was never satisfied. He revised constantly, adjusted endlessly, questioned his own conclusions. There is no final version, no moment where everything is declared complete, just a continuous process of exploration, an unfinished mind. And perhaps that is what makes his work feel so modern. Because progress itself is unfinished. Every discovery leads to another question. Every solution reveals a new limitation. The boundary between what is possible and what is not continues to shift, just as it did in Leonardo's time. He simply stood at that boundary earlier than most. So when looking at his inventions today, it becomes clear that they are not relics of the past. They are reminders. That innovation is not a destination, it is a direction. Captured, betrayed, and sold, the fall of Joan of Arc did not begin with flames, but with a shift so subtle it almost went unnoticed. Only months earlier, she had stood at the centre of something extraordinary. A peasant girl claiming divine voices had led French forces to victories that felt, to many, like miracles. Cities opened, armies advanced. Hope, long buried under years of war, returned. But victories do not last forever. By the time she reached the walls of Compiègne, the rhythm had changed. The campaigns were slower. The unity she once inspired had begun to fracture. Commanders hesitated. Political tensions resurfaced. What had once been momentum now felt uncertain, like a force beginning to lose direction. And then came the moment. During a military engagement outside the city, Joan led a charge against Burgundian forces. French allies aligned with England. It was a risky move, but not unusual for her. She had built her reputation on boldness, on pushing forward when others held back. But this time, the retreat came too quickly. As the fighting shifted, the gates of Compiègne closed behind the withdrawing troops. Whether out of panic, miscommunication, or deliberate decision, the result was the same. Joan was left outside, surrounded, The chaos of battle gave way to something quieter, more final. She was pulled from her horse, captured by soldiers who likely understood exactly who they had taken. Not just a prisoner, but a symbol. And symbols have value. She was not executed on the battlefield. She was not treated as an ordinary captive. Instead, she was held, transferred, negotiated over, because this was no longer just a military situation. It was political. The Burgundians had something the English desperately wanted, and eventually they sold her, not as a soldier, not even as an enemy leader, but as a problem that needed to be erased. From that moment on, everything changed. The battlefield was gone, the noise of war replaced by something colder, more controlled. A different kind of conflict was beginning, one that would not be fought with weapons, but with words, accusations, and judgment. And unlike the battles she had won before, this was a fight she was never meant to win, because Joan of Arc had been captured. But more importantly, she had been handed over. Once captured, Joan of Arc ceased to be a soldier. She became a transaction. The Burgundians understood her value immediately. She was not just a prisoner of war. She was a symbol that had shaken the balance of power. Her presence on the battlefield had inspired French forces and unsettled the English. Victories followed her, and with them came something far more dangerous than military success: belief. To her allies, she was chosen. To her enemies, she was something that needed to be explained, and then destroyed. Keeping her was never the goal. Selling her was. Negotiations began quietly but with clear intent. The English wanted her, not simply to remove her from the war, but to control the narrative surrounding her. Killing her as a prisoner would have been simple, but ineffective. It would have risked turning her into a martyr. What they needed was something else. Discredit. If Joan could be proven false, if her visions could be labelled heresy, her actions reframed as deception, then everything she had accomplished would collapse with her. Her victories would lose meaning. Her influence would fade. The idea of her would be erased. And so a price was agreed. She was handed over to English authorities, not as a warrior, but as a subject for trial. The battlefield had already failed to stop her. Now they would try something more controlled, something legal, or at least something that appeared to be. From that moment forward, Joan was no longer treated as a military prisoner. She was placed under ecclesiastical jurisdiction, meaning her fate would be decided by church officials. This shift was critical. It transformed her from a combatant into a spiritual problem, and spiritual problems could be judged. She was transported under heavy guard, moved away from familiar territory into a system designed to isolate her. No allies, no army, no battlefield where courage could translate into action. Only questions, only scrutiny. The English did not fear her strength. They feared what she represented. A young woman claiming divine authority, challenging established power, succeeding where others had failed. This was not something that could be allowed to stand. If left unchallenged, it could spread. It could inspire others. It could weaken the structures that held authority in place. So the goal became clear, not just to defeat Joan of Arc, but to redefine her, to take everything she had been, and turn it into something else entirely. Because if belief had made her powerful, then doubt could destroy her. By the time Joan of Arc arrived in Rouen, the outcome was no longer uncertain. Only the process remained. The English did not rush. They understood that speed would weaken the illusion. What they needed was not just a judgment, but a performance. A trial that looked legitimate, structured, and grounded in authority. Something that would transform her execution into something that felt justified. And so, the court was assembled. Clerics, theologians, and officials gathered under the authority of Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a man aligned with English interests. The setting was not a battlefield, but a chamber of law. No weapons, no banners, just questions. Endless questions. From the beginning, the focus was clear. This was not about her military actions. It was about her claims, her voices, her visions, her insistence that she had been guided by divine instruction. That was the target, because if those claims could be discredited, everything else would follow. The interrogations began slowly, carefully. Joan was asked about her childhood, her experiences, the nature of the voices she claimed to hear. Saints, she said. Guidance, she insisted. Certainty, she maintained. But certainty was dangerous. The court pressed harder. They questioned her authority. How could a young, uneducated woman claim to speak for God? Why would divine instruction contradict established church hierarchy? Why did she wear men's clothing, something considered deeply inappropriate, even sinful at the time? Every answer she gave was examined, dissected, turned against her, and yet she did not collapse. Despite the pressure, despite the isolation, she responded with a composure that unsettled her judges. She did not speak like someone confused or uncertain. She spoke with clarity, often redirecting questions, sometimes refusing to answer traps designed to incriminate her. At times she outmaneuvered them, and that made her more dangerous, because the trial was not meant to discover truth, it was meant to produce it, a specific truth, one that aligned with the needs of those in power, and Joan did not fit easily into that narrative. So the process continued, sessions stretched on, questions repeated, pressure increased. The goal was no longer just to challenge her, it was to break her, to force a contradiction, a confession, a moment of doubt that could be used to justify what had already been decided. Because beneath the structure, beneath the language of law and faith, one fact remained unchanged. This was not a trial to determine her fate, it was a trial designed to confirm it. As the trial continued, something unexpected happened. Joan of Arc did not behave like someone on trial for her life. She did not plead. She did not panic. She did not retreat into silence. Instead, she answered calmly, directly, and at times with a sharp clarity that unsettled the very men questioning her. The court had expected confusion. They had expected contradiction. What they found instead was control. Again and again they tried to corner her. Are you in God's grace? It was a trap. If she said yes, she risked claiming certainty only the church could grant. Heresy. If she said no, she admitted guilt. Her answer came without hesitation. If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God keep me there. It was not defiance. It was precision. She avoided the trap entirely. Moments like this began to define the trial. The judges asked, expecting to lead her into error. Instead, they found themselves facing someone who understood the weight of each word, who navigated their questions with unexpected intelligence. And this made the situation worse, because the trial needed weakness. It needed doubt, confusion, inconsistency, something that could be used to justify the outcome already decided. But Joan continued to present something else entirely. Conviction. Not loud, not dramatic. Unshakable. She maintained that her voices came from God, that her actions were guided, not chosen, that she had done nothing wrong by following what she believed to be divine instruction. To the court, this was not faith. It was a threat, because her claims bypassed the authority of the church itself. If a young woman could receive guidance directly from God, then what did that say about the system built to interpret his will? What did it say about those sitting in judgment? The trial was no longer just about Joan, it was about control, and control could not tolerate uncertainty. So the tone began to shift. The questions became more aggressive, the pressure more deliberate. Isolation intensified. She was denied legal counsel, surrounded by hostile examiners, and constantly reminded of the consequences she faced. Submission, or death. But even as the weight of the trial pressed down, her position remained the same. She would not deny what she believed. She would not reshape her story to fit their expectations. And that left the court with a problem, because they had built a process designed to break her, and she was not breaking. The trial had not produced what it needed. No confession, no collapse, no moment where Joan of Arc abandoned her claims or contradicted herself in a way that could justify immediate condemnation. So the strategy changed. If she would not break through questioning, she would be forced to bend through pressure. Her conditions worsened. She was held in an English-controlled prison, guarded not by neutral authorities, but by soldiers loyal to those who wanted her condemned. She was isolated, denied the protections typically granted to prisoners under church jurisdiction. No comforting presence, no advocate, no voice on her side, only supervision. Constant suffocating supervision. The message was clear, she was alone. And then came the threat, not vague, not implied, explicit. Execution by fire. The court presented it not as a punishment, but as a consequence. A path that could still be avoided if she chose correctly. If she submitted, if she agreed to renounce her visions, to admit error, to place herself fully under the authority of the church. All she had to do was say the words. And live. For the first time, hesitation appeared, not as doubt in her beliefs, but as recognition of what stood before her. The abstract threat of death had become something concrete, immediate, real. Flames were no longer symbolic. They were inevitable if she refused. And she was still young, not a distant historical figure, not a legend yet, a teenager, facing something few could endure. Under this pressure, something shifted. She signed a document, an abjuration, a statement that suggested she would submit, that she would no longer claim divine guidance in the same way, that she would accept the authority imposed upon her. It was not a full denial, but it was enough. Enough for the court to pause. Enough to step back from immediate execution. On the surface, it looked like a victory for them. The unbreakable figure had finally yielded. The narrative could be reshaped, the threat neutralized, but the situation was more fragile than it appeared, because submission under pressure is not the same as belief. And within that signed statement lay something unstable, something temporary. The court had forced a moment of compliance, but they had not changed her conviction. And that difference would matter, because what comes next would not be about pressure. It would be about choice. And this time, the consequences would be final. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the trial had reached its conclusion. Joan of Arc had signed the document. The court had what it needed. Submission, at least on paper. The immediate threat of execution was lifted. The machinery of judgment slowed. But something did not hold. Because the signature had not come from belief, it had come from pressure. Removed from the intensity of that moment, the reality of what she had agreed to began to settle. The document did not just soften her claims, it redefined them. It suggested that her voices were false, that her actions had been misguided, that the foundation of everything she had stood for was, in the eyes of the court, an error, and that was something she could not accept. Soon after, she reversed her position. She declared that her voices had not abandoned her, that they were real, that what she had signed did not reflect the truth she believed. In doing so, she placed herself back into the exact position the court had been trying to force her out of. This act was more than defiance. It was final. Because within the structure of the trial, this reversal had a specific meaning. It transformed her from someone who had erred into someone who had relapsed. A repeat offender in the eyes of the court. A heretic who had been given a chance to recant and had chosen not to remain within it. And that carried consequences, irreversible ones. There are different accounts of what triggered this return. Some suggest she resumed wearing men's clothing, something the court had explicitly forbidden, possibly out of necessity for protection in prison. Others point to the simple fact that her conviction had never truly changed. Either way, the result was the same. The court now had what it needed. Not just resistance, but confirmation. The structure that had been carefully built, the questions, the pressure, the forced submission, had led to this moment. A moment where she stepped back into her original claims, not under coercion, but by choice. And choice is harder to dismiss, because it removes doubt. It removes ambiguity. It turns the narrative into something clean, something decisive, something that can be used to justify what comes next. Joan had been given a path to survival, and she had stepped away from it. Not because she did not understand the consequences, but because she refused to accept a version of herself that was not true. And in doing so, she sealed her fate, not through weakness, but through conviction. Once Joan of Arc returned to her original claims, the trial no longer needed to continue. It only needed to conclude. The court moved quickly now. The careful pacing, the extended questioning, the appearance of uncertainty, all of it disappeared. What had once been a slow process of pressure became something direct, final. She was declared a relapsed heretic. The term carried weight. It meant she had already been given a chance to correct herself, to submit, to align with the authority judging her, and by returning to her claims, she had rejected that opportunity. Within the structure of the law, this left only one outcome: execution. The sentence was read publicly, not in anger, not in haste, but with the calm authority of something that had been decided long before it was spoken. The language was formal, controlled, almost detached from the reality it described. Condemned, handed over to secular authorities for punishment. This detail mattered. The church, in theory, did not execute. It judged. The act of killing was passed to civil power, creating a separation that preserved the appearance of moral distance. But the result was the same. Death by fire. There was no appeal, no delay, no sudden reversal waiting at the last moment. The process had moved too far, the narrative too firmly established. To change course now would not only undermine the trial, it would weaken the authority behind it, and authority could not afford that. What remains striking is her response. There is no record of panic, no collapse into despair that matches the weight of what had just been declared. There was fear, certainly. No one stands before such a sentence without it. But alongside it remained something else. Clarity. She asked for a cross. She requested that it be held before her as she faced what was coming. It was not a gesture of resistance, but of alignment. A final confirmation of the belief she had refused to abandon. Even now, with the outcome certain, her position did not change. The court had achieved its goal. The symbol had been contained, defined, and condemned. But in doing so, something else had taken shape. Because the sentence did not erase her, it fixed her. No longer a figure moving through uncertainty, through battle, through trial. She became something still, something final, a story with an ending. And as the decision settled into reality, one thing became clear. The trial was over. What remained was the fire. The morning of execution arrived without ceremony. In the marketplace of Rouen, a crowd gathered, not for celebration, but for witness. Executions were public. They were meant to be seen, to be remembered, to reinforce the authority that had ordered them. At the centre stood the stake, and beside it Joan of Arc. She was dressed simply, without armour, without the presence that had once defined her on the battlefield. No banners, no army, no movement forward, only stillness. The trial had stripped everything away except the one thing she had refused to surrender. Her belief. A sermon was delivered before the sentence was carried out. Words meant to justify what was about to happen, to frame it as necessary, lawful, even righteous. The language was controlled, measured, carefully constructed to maintain the structure that had brought everyone to this moment. But beneath it, the reality remained unchanged. A young woman was about to be burned alive. She asked again for a cross. One was placed before her, held up so she could see it clearly. Another, made hastily from wood, was given to her to hold. It was not an act of defiance, but of focus, something to fix her attention on as everything else closed in. Then the fire was lit. At first it was slow, smoke rising, flames beginning to take hold. The crowd watched in silence, the sound of the fire growing, the space around her filling with heat and movement. There was no quick end, no sudden escape from what was happening. It was gradual, deliberate, witnessed. Accounts describe her calling out, not in panic, but in prayer, repeating the name of Jesus as the flames rose, again and again until the smoke overtook her voice. And then, nothing. The fire continued long after she was gone, not just to ensure death, but to erase what remained. Ashes scattered, remnants destroyed. No relics, no physical trace that could be preserved or venerated. The intention was clear. This was meant to end her story, completely. But something did not disappear with the flames, because as the fire burned, the image of her did not collapse into silence. It hardened, fixed in the memory of those who watched, those who heard, those who would carry the story forward. The execution had achieved its purpose, but not its result, because Joan of Arc was gone. And yet, she had never felt more present. For a time it seemed the story had ended in Rouen. Joan of Arc had been condemned, executed, and erased as completely as possible. The trial had done its work. The narrative had been rewritten. The threat had been removed. But time has a way of undoing certainty. Years passed. The war shifted. Power changed hands. And with those changes came something unexpected. A reconsideration. Not immediately, not easily. But slowly, questions began to return. The trial that had once appeared controlled and authoritative started to look different when viewed from a distance. Irregularities emerged. Procedures questioned. Motives examined. What had been presented as justice began to resemble something else entirely. Political. And that mattered. Because the same structures that had condemned her could now be challenged. The same authority that had defined her as a heretic could be re-evaluated under new conditions. So a new trial was called. not to judge her again, but to judge the judgment itself. Witnesses were brought forward, testimonies revisited, the events surrounding her capture, her imprisonment, and her interrogation were examined in detail. The pressure she had faced, the absence of proper defence, the environment in which she had been forced to respond, all of it came under scrutiny. And the conclusion was clear. The original trial had been flawed, not slightly, fundamentally. The charges, the procedures, the outcome. Each part was called into question until the entire structure collapsed under its own contradictions. The verdict that had once seemed final was overturned. Joan of Arc was declared innocent, not just of specific accusations, but of the identity that had been imposed upon her. The label of heretic was removed, her actions reframed, her story rewritten once more, but this time in the opposite direction. Too late to save her. But not too late to change what she meant. This reversal did something the fire could not. It restored her. Not physically, not in life, but in memory. The same system that had condemned her now acknowledged its error, and in doing so transformed her from a cautionary example into something else entirely. A figure of conviction, of resistance, of belief that did not bend under pressure. And perhaps that is where her story truly ends. Not at the stake, but in the quiet realization that the judgment passed against her could not hold. Because the flames had taken her life, but they had not taken the truth, and in the end, it was the judgment, not Joan, that failed.